I'm Mary Kristen Valentine, and I served as board chair in 2021, a pivotal year for Remind as the organization decided to become a hybrid program of both online and in-person free support groups. Remind has a rich history that began with Gary Levering, a man brave enough to announce he had bipolar disorder to his friends. Gary passed away in 2014, but his mission lives on through Remind. And I'm pleased to say that joining us now is Joanne Levering, Gary's wife. Joanne, how did Gary's journey with bipolar disorder begin, and how did he come about starting Remind?
Gary really wasn't diagnosed until after we got married. We came back to Houston so he could work at a law firm, and he went to see a psychiatrist, but I wasn't very supportive. I didn't understand, so I think I ignored him. Then he said we needed to see a psychologist, which we did, and she finally looked at Gary and said, "You need a psychiatrist." So he chose Susan Backus, who talked him into taking meds, and that's when he started on his medication. He was paying for his own meds. Again, another thing that insurance wouldn't pay for him, he didn't think, and they might find out he was bipolar and drop him. Then he decided he needed a little support group. So he and Linda Condon started one at Chapelwood Church, and they went every week. Then he said to me he would like to speak to his breakfast club. And I tried to talk him out of it because I said, our daughter Leanne is getting married in a couple of weeks and nobody will come to the wedding. So he waited. Leanne got married, people came, and then he talked to the breakfast club. And they were so supportive, they gave him a standing ovation. They'd never done that for any speaker. At that point, people started calling us, people who had mental illnesses. They wanted help, but they didn't want Gary to tell anybody. They didn't even want him to tell me some of the time. Some of the people told me. He even had a doctor friend that said, "Don't let anybody know, nobody will come to me professionally if they find out."
So Joanne, today Remind has more than 60 groups throughout Houston, as you know, but it began with one. How did Gary go about growing his support groups?
And even that first one, I'm not sure that Remind was started. Just he and Linda Condon decided they would have this support group. At that point, Gary went to his close friends, Carol Ann and Bob Paddock, because they had started charitable things before. And he said, "I'd like to start this organization, and I have a board who have promised to help of 4 people. And they laughed at him. Said, "You need 20 people on that board." So Gary went to work. And you really don't say no to Gary very often. So he got this board, and then they needed money. His friend Philip Berger had tickets to the Super Bowl, which was in Houston that year. And he gave Gary 4 tickets, and he said, "Why don't you sell chances on these tickets?" So for a month, Gary went to the country clubs, he went to see all his friends and sold chances. And then he and myself and Wells McGee decided that we would go to this sports bar, and sell more chances and have a drawing. The winner of the drawing was our friend Jimmy Gibbs. And Jimmy said, "Gary, I'm giving you the tickets back. Start selling again." So he and Wells went out and started selling. I don't remember who really won the tickets in the end, but they had enough money to get started. Gary would write a personal thank you note to everybody who gave money, be it a friend, a foundation, someone he didn't even know. He would write this note. In fact, a friend called one day and said, "I've given to a lot of charitable organizations and no one ever wrote me a personal thank you note." At that point, Gary went out and bought a bunch of Crane stationery, had his name put on it, and he went to the office every day and wrote thank you notes.
So what do you think Gary would think of where Remind is today?
Oh, Gary would be so pleased. He loved Remind. He absolutely loved it. He always wanted to help other people, and this was his way, he thought, to have these support groups. And it's turned out that is the way he could help others with bipolar. All the people that were running Remind then were his friends, and they would say, you can't say no to Gary Levering. He had that kind of impact on people, and it lives on today with Remind.
I've found that the greatest joy that I get in life is in helping others in a deeply personal way. Thank you for listening.
I'm Fran Litton, Board Chair 2006. My longtime friend Gary Levering felt his life had been saved by the free support groups he attended weekly. He wanted to expand the groups to help even more people affected by depression and bipolar disorders. He asked me to serve on the new board he was creating. When I first became board chair, we had an office in the basement of the building where Gary worked. In the early years, members of the board did a lot of the work that current Remind staff does now. When Remind started, there were only 5 groups. Within a couple of years, working with Gary and other dedicated board members, we expanded to over 30 free support groups serving hundreds of people. We used paid licensed facilitators for our youth groups. But for our adult groups, we decided to use volunteer peer facilitators, trained and managed by professional program coordinators, which enabled us to grow even faster. To support this rapid expansion, the board realized we needed to have a fundraiser. Phyllis Selber was instrumental in making this happen. Carol Ann and Bob Paddock graciously chaired our first luncheon. Since the beginning, Remind has been fortunate to have such a dedicated board and talented professional staff.
I'm Dr. Jan Redford, board chair of Remind in 2010. My ties to this organization are both personal and professional. I knew Gary Levering and was also a psychologist at the University of Houston. Gary called me one day and said, how would you like to join a small visionary group with Peggy Rowe, Flo McGee, Bob Paddock, and a few others? From there, the organization came to life. Gary had tremendous courage to come out and share with everyone that he had bipolar disorder. He also knew that in the Houston area, there were thousands of people who also had this same illness but could not afford services, and he wanted to help them. When Remind added professional licensed facilitators, I was proud to work closely with board members and psychologists Martha Hanson and Peggy Landrum to set up criteria for hiring professionals. My largest contribution was providing a pathway to open high school groups for adolescents through my relationship with communities and schools. Remind understood the importance of early intervention and wanted to play a larger role in supporting the youth in our community.
I'm Blake Williams, board chair of Remind in 2014. 2014 was unique because, sadly, it was the year our founder, Gary Levering, passed away. At the time, the organization was not focused as much on growing as it was on the quality of its programs and the benefit people could receive. Gary wanted to make sure Remind support groups were the right size with the right facilitators who had the right training. There was a focus on making sure we had people in place who understood different areas of the city so we could properly serve different cultures and ethnic groups. Gary was fearless at a time when mental health issues were not discussed.
I hope the truth about me hasn't been too uncomfortable for you. Frankly, this hasn't been easy, but I hope you see why I'm no longer ashamed or feel guilty or secretive about my illness. It's just another illness, and it happens to affect my brain.
He was a pioneer. As an adult and part of a different generation, he spoke at a large gathering at River Oaks Country Club to explain what life was like with bipolar disorder. He said things that may have been shocking, but he broke down barriers, allowing others to share their experiences, and a movement was born.
Help erase the stigma of mental illness. It's just another illness. It just happens to affect the brain, and it's treatable. People are not getting the treatment that they need because of the stigma of mental illness.
Since Gary passed, Remind has continued to thrive, in large part because of the dedication of the board, chairman, and staff who had the heart and conviction to propel Remind's mission forward.
I'm Peggy Rowe, board chairman in 2015. My friend Gary Levering recruited me to help with his new organization because of my fundraising background. I have also served as interim executive director. Looking back, 2015 was pivotal to the organization's future. It was the year after Gary passed away, and the board was positioning itself for the next iteration of what would become Remind. When the entity began, it was part of a national organization, Depression Bipolar Support Alliance, also known as DBSA. Over time, we realized the name DBSA had no particular meaning, so we decided to create a separate identity for the Houston chapter. Fred Dunlop, one of our many talented board members, served as pro bono legal counsel to redefine our relationship with a national organization. We officially adopted the name Remind under Phyllis Silber's chairmanship in 2016. The board chose the name Remind because it contains an element of optimism. One can redo one's mind and change one's hope for the future. For some individuals, though, loss of hope can lead to loss of life. This irreversible, tragic situation led us to host a series of suicide convocations open to the board and their guests. Besides learning more about how mental illness can lead to death by suicide, the attendees were also able to share their stories of how such losses had affected their lives. Since that time, addressing the topic of suicide has become a larger part of Remind's curriculum. And I'm grateful to say that we are active and avid educators of suicide awareness.
I'm David Kinder, Board Chair 2019. I became involved after Blake Williams invited me to attend the annual luncheon. I'd lost my mom to depression and I was trying to better understand it. I don't know if it was an act of God or a coincidence, but Terry Bradshaw was speaking that year and I felt very moved by what he had to say. When I took over as chair in 2019, it immediately became a big year with the onboarding of our new Executive Director, Jennifer Leal. There was continued expansion of support groups into schools, which I felt strongly about because I have school-age kids and I see the impact mental health services have on youth. The Circles of Hope Luncheon in 2019 featured famed baseball player Darryl Strawberry, and it was one of our most successful events. Another highlight of 2019 was the solidification of the online platform, which allowed Remind to host online support groups. If there is one thing I've learned throughout my years with Remind, it's that anyone can be impacted by mental illness. Remind provides a way for people to discuss and share stories of their mental health journey instead of sweeping it under the rug. My mom did not have a support group like that, and I'm not saying it would have fixed everything, but it might have helped.
I'm Ronnie Cunod, Board Chair 2020. What can I say about chairing at the outset of the pandemic? Well, it wasn't boring. While potentially calamitous, Jennifer Leal, the staff and board, led Remind through one of the most pivotal years in its history, and we made it through stronger. Whether serendipity or providence, Remind had opportunistically overhauled its IT systems in December 2019. Further, in early January 2020, we started a pilot program of our online groups with Texas Women's University. Between the IT upgrade and the online pilot program, Remind was technologically and programmatically ready to pivot and adapt very quickly to the constraints of the pandemic. It was clear from the national conversation that the need for mental health education was growing as people faced new challenges. But we knew that already from our staff, licensed facilitators, and group clients. The Remind team embraced challenge with changes in our social media and marketing. Our program team developed a proprietary educational series on depression and bipolar disorder, the first in Remind history. I'm very proud of our Remind team, and I'm sincerely thankful for the generosity of our donors. They saw what Remind was doing and stepped up to support our mission. Thanks to all of them, Remind was able to continue delivering free support group services when they were needed most. It was the silver lining that shaped the way people can access our services.
I'm Bob Paddock, Board Chair 2013. On behalf of all past chairs, we are proud of what Remind has accomplished these past 20+ years, providing support groups to thousands of people living with and affected by depression and bipolar disorder.
If you or a loved one are struggling in any way with a mental illness and you haven't found success yet, hold on to hope. If you haven't found that solution, it's either out there or it's on its way.